RAD PHP XE2 adds a new mobile application project and mobile page item. RAD PHP XE2 adds these 37 jQuery mobile components so you can create rich, accessible, touch-friendly websites and apps on the popular Android and iOS mobile device platform. So here we see the 20 mobile hardware components, like the accelerometer and the camera, and the 17 mobile components like an M button and an M list. Now, after we create our mobile application in the IDE, we'll use this new wizard for PhoneGap to generate all the files we need to create our native iOS and or Android mobile application based on web technologies. Here we are in RAD PHP XE2. Now, the first thing we want to do is create a new mobile application. So I'm going to click on New Items icon, and then under RAD PHP Projects, I'm going to select Mobile Applications and click OK. Now, by doing this, our mobile application gets created, and I could see under the tool palette, I now have jQuery mobile components. Now, I also have the option of either creating an iPhone application, an iPad application, or I can add a new device such as an Android device. For this application, I'm going to use a iPhone 3G. Now, to this project, I want to add an MList component from the jQuery mobile components. So I take my MList component and I drop it onto my phone. Now, an MList component is a dynamic list that we're going to use to fill up with data. And this can be done either by entering it manually, or we can set up a database connection and retrieve the data from a database. So the next thing I want to do to get the data, I'm going to use a database connection. So I'm going to go to my Data Explorer tab, and here I see a list of supported databases. For this application, I'm going to use a MySQL database, and I'm going to use the OS Commerce database that's included with RAD PHP XE2. I'm going to open up my OS Commerce database. I'm going to look at the tables I have available to me, and I'm going to take the categories table and drop it onto my device. So now by dropping it on the device, so now I'm going to run the application to test the MySQL connection. We see the categories get displayed, so that's a real good test to verify that we can connect and get data returned from our categories table. So in addition to our database component and table component and data source component, I'm going to add a query component onto the form. And now that I have a query component on my form, I'm going to set its database to be our OS Commerce database, where I'm going to enter the query that I want to get run that will initially get displayed on my MList. Here what I want to write is, select asterisk from categories, left join categories underscore description on categories ID equals category ID from the two tables. So that'll bring back English category descriptions. So now the next thing I want to do is add that query to my MList component. So I select the MList component. I have its data source set to our categories table. And inside of data source, instead of bringing back the entire table, I want to set that to my query component. Now the next thing I want to do is set my data mappings on my MList to correspond to my database table values to display on the MList. Inside of my MList component, under my data mappings, first thing I want to set is my base parent field, and I'm going to set that to the value 0, and that's going to be the first value or the column to display on our MList. Under the caption, and so for caption, we want that to be what we want to use for each element on the MList. So in our case, it's going to be our categories name. The next thing I want to set is the ID field. I want to set to be my categories ID. And lastly, I want to establish the parent field. I want that to be the parent ID from the tables. And let's test to see if the information displays on my MList. And sure enough, our MList displays my category values on the first page. Now, clicking on one of these categories like hardware should drill down to its subcategory. we see graphics cards comes up. So now that we have our working mobile application in RAD PHP XE2, we now want to create a mobile application that will display this data on either an Android or an iOS device, such as an iPhone. On my MPage component, there is a property called useAjax, and I want to set that property to be true. Next, I want to establish the Ajax URI. So there's a property called useAjax URI that I'm going to connect to. So for this demonstration, I'm going to use my own local box that we've been using. Next, we'll use the new Wizard for PhoneGap feature to create our mobile application. Now, to access the wizard, it's from Tools, Wizard for PhoneGap. Now, for this demonstration, I'm going to create an Android application. Now, on this application setup screen, our index page, that's going to be our unit1.php from our current project. For our application name, I'm going to call this application our PHP Code Rage 6 application. Now, on our graphics Android page, we can substitute the default icon for the application to a different icon. In this case, I'm going to leave it as default and click Next. Now here, we get to choose a destination folder. At this point, all of our Android Java files get created for us. So by clicking Next, I'm at the screen that says Run My Application. So if I had a real Android device, I could select Real Device and have it USB connected to my laptop, and it would want to upload the application to my real device and run it. In my case, I don't have an actual Android device, so I'm going to select an emulator. On my box, I have an Android 2.1 emulator, so I'm going to select that. Now here, as we see under the console output, here we're going to run the Android ADB server. We're going to set up the Android SDK tools. We're going to compile the files into Java classes. We're going to create the final Android APK file to upload into our Android device. At this point, it's waiting for my Android simulator to be started. And if I had it started, it would want to upload our APK file to the simulator and run the application. Another way to do it is to import the application into an Android Eclipse development environment and run it that way. I'm going to create a new Android project, and I want to import that existing source code that we got from the PhoneGap wizard, and we're going to use the Android 2.1 emulator. And now at this point, I can right-click on the project and say Run as an Android application, and load the application into my Android environment, connect to the backend PHP Apache server, call that first unit1.php file, access the backend database, and display the values on my Android device. Select it. It fires up, and the first thing we should see is our mlist get displayed on our device with our data. So that's great. So let me switch back into RAD PHP XE2, and now let's create the same application for an iOS device. So using the same tools, Wizard for PhoneGap, this time I'll pick iOS. Here, now for the application setup screen, we see one additional box to allow us to enter our Apple Developer ID. So by entering our Apple Developer ID, we can sign our app and prepare it for submission to the App Store. Here's our graphics iOS screen where we can change default icons for what the application will look like on the iOS device. Now at this point, it's going to create the source code files for us. So in this case, it's going to create Xcode files, and then I would transfer those Xcode files to a Mac and run them on our Mac Xcode iOS simulator and emulate or simulate running an iOS device. So that's pretty cool.